Indonesia, Southeast Asia's largest economy, has been making headlines for its ongoing tax reforms, including raising taxes across various sectors. These measures, while often controversial, reflect a broader strategy to address the country's economic challenges and long-term development goals. In recent years, Indonesia's tax policies have undergone a series of adjustments aimed at strengthening the country's fiscal position. Among these changes, the most notable is the incremental raising of the value-added tax (VAT) rate from 10% to 11% in 2022, with a further increase to 12% expected by January 1, 2025. This increase has led to significant public opposition, with discussions and grievances spreading across the internet. But why? What's wrong with Indonesia increasing its VAT from 11% in 2022 to 12% in 2025? Isn't it just a 1% increase? Will it really affect many Indonesians? Perhaps the most important question is, why is the Indonesian government even increasing the VAT rate? Will this help Indonesia? To understand this, it's important to first define what a value-added tax is. VAT is a form of consumption tax levied on goods and services at each stage of the supply chain, from production to sale. For instance, every time a product moves from one stage to the next, like from a manufacturer to a distributor or from a distributor to a retailer, a VAT is applied to the value added at that stage. Ultimately, the cost is passed on to the end consumer, making VAT a tax that directly impacts everyday purchases. For example, a product or service that would cost 1,000 Indonesian rupiah under a 10% VAT would cost 1,100 rupiah at the same rate. With the VAT increasing to 11%, the cost would rise to 1,110 rupiah, and when it rises to 12%, it will cost 1,120 rupiah. While these increases may seem insignificant, the cumulative effect on household budgets can be substantial, particularly for low- and middle-income families. It's important to note that Indonesia is not the only country with a VAT. Many governments around the world rely on VAT as a revenue source. Here's a comparison of VAT rates in Southeast Asia. The Philippines has a VAT rate of over 12%. Thailand's rate is 7%, although it has historically risen to 10% and is subject to government discretion. Malaysia, after some policy reversals, ended up with a 6% sales and service tax, SST, after scrapping its 6% GST in 2018. Thus, Indonesia's previous 10% rate was neither the highest nor the lowest in the region, but it was a core contributor to government revenue. Globally, Indonesia's VAT rate of 10%, or even the upcoming 12%, is relatively low. The average VAT rate among OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, countries hovers around 20%. This suggests that Indonesia's VAT increase may be necessary for staying competitive on the global stage. So, why impose a VAT? VAT is one of the most important revenue sources for governments because it is easier to collect than other forms of taxation, such as income tax. To illustrate this, here's a graph showing Indonesia's share of domestic revenue by source, based on data from CIC. From 2015 to 2023, income tax revenues contributed nearly 40% of domestic revenue annually. The second largest contributor was VAT and sales tax on luxury goods, accounting for 27.6% of total domestic revenue in 2023. If the government wants to increase revenue, raising the VAT rate is an effective option. But why specifically VAT and not other taxes? VAT is considered more stable during economic downturns since consumption does not drop as drastically as corporate profits or personal incomes. Furthermore, Indonesia's large population of over 270 million, the world's fourth largest, means the government has a significant responsibility to provide infrastructure, healthcare, education, and social programs. Over the past few years, Indonesia has seen an increase in its fiscal budget deficit. This may seem abstract, so let's look at a graph on the government budget deficit per year, using data from the Indonesian Ministry of Finance. This data shows the annual difference between government revenue and expenditures. A fiscal deficit occurs when the government spends more than it earns through taxes, customs duties, and other sources of revenue. For Indonesia, the deficit has widened significantly in recent years, especially from 2020 to 2022, with 2020 showing a deficit of 6.1% of GDP. This is a major reason for raising the VAT rate. Persistent deficits strain the economy, forcing the government to borrow to cover the gap, which increases national debt. Higher VAT rates aim to reduce this deficit, stabilize the fiscal position, and fund essential services for the population. Here's a graph on Indonesia's national debt to GDP, using data collected from the International Monetary Fund. As you can see, the debt to GDP ratio increased from just 30.6% in 2019 to over 39.7% in 2020, with the latest data for 2024 showing a ratio of 40.5%. But in all honesty, this isn't particularly high, especially when compared to other neighboring economies. In fact, let's examine the largest debt to GDP holders in Southeast Asia. Indonesia ranks among the lowest, with Vietnam being the lowest among the region's big five economies, followed by Indonesia. Knowing this, why increase taxes to combat debt? While Indonesia's debt levels might be relatively low, the VAT increase is aimed at ensuring that the debt remains manageable in the long term. Instead of allowing debt levels to rise unchecked, the government is taking proactive measures to prevent future fiscal challenges. A second reason behind Indonesia's VAT increase is the need to align with international standards. While Indonesia's VAT rate might soon become one of the highest in Southeast Asia, it is still far below the rates seen in OECD countries. Considering Indonesia is one of the world's largest economies and is expected to grow even further, aligning its VAT rate with global averages is a logical step. The third, and perhaps most important, reason is that Indonesia's VAT, despite being competitively high in Southeast Asia, may not be collecting enough revenue. This can be seen in a graph showing the share of VAT revenue as a percentage of GDP. Using data from the OECD, Indonesia's VAT revenue was just 3.4% of GDP in 2022. In comparison, the Asia-Pacific region averaged 4.8%, middle-income countries averaged 5.5%, and the OECD average was 7.1%. This data highlights that Indonesia collects significantly less revenue from its VAT relative to the size of its economy compared to other regions and income groups. Even when compared to economies like the Philippines, Thailand, China, and the United Kingdom, Indonesia's VAT to GDP ratio is strikingly low. By increasing VAT from 10% to 11% and eventually to 12%, Indonesia hopes to catch up with its neighbors and global averages. But why is Indonesia's VAT to GDP ratio so low? There are several reasons, but a major one is Indonesia's economic structure. The country has a substantial informal sector that operates largely outside the formal tax system. This sector includes small-scale businesses, street vendors, and other unregistered enterprises that do not regularly pay taxes, including VAT. As a result, a significant portion of Indonesia's economic activity does not contribute to VAT revenue, limiting the government's ability to fully harness its tax potential. Additionally, Indonesia's overall tax to GDP ratio is low when compared to other economies. Using data from the UNU Wider Government Revenue Dataset, 2023, Indonesia's tax to GDP ratio was just 10.4% in 2022. Compared to Thailand, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia, Indonesia's tax to GDP ratio is the lowest. It is even lower when compared to other G20 economies like Brazil, South Africa, China, and India. By increasing VAT, Indonesia aims to not only boost its VAT to GDP ratio but also its overall tax to GDP ratio. As mentioned earlier, the VAT increase has been met with public criticism, as higher VAT rates result in increased prices for goods and services. This is especially burdensome for low and middle-income households, who are most sensitive to price increases. However, the Indonesian government has introduced measures to mitigate the impact of the VAT hike. Reports suggest an economic stimulus package totaling approximately 827 trillion rupiah, US $51.5 billion, will be implemented to support consumers, particularly low and middle-income households. The package includes measures such as electricity tariff reductions, fiscal incentives, and VAT exemptions. Beyond the VAT increase from 11% to 12%, it has also been reported that VAT will now apply to certain goods and services for the first time, including premium quality food, international schools, and high-end hospitals.